Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and today we are evaluating build guides. We're giving you 6 tips for selecting the best build guide for you, for your goals, and for your own personal enjoyment as you play everybody's favorite action RPG, Path of Exile. You can of course give us a like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications about more videos just like this one. And of course the timestamps for various parts of this discussion are located just above my slightly balding forehead, and those are hot linked down below in the video description for your convenience. So let's jump right into it. First off, our very first tip is the build explained well. And really, if there was only one tip that I could give everybody that watches or that plays Path of Exile, this would be it. Is the build explained well? When you are evaluating a build guide, you need to evaluate it on how you can actually interact with the knowledge and the information presented in the build guide. It could be the world's greatest build, but if it's explained poorly, then you and I aren't necessarily going to use it because we're not really going to understand what's going on inside the build itself. So what do I mean by this? First off, the presentation. Is the information color-coded, given clear paragraph headers? Is it easy to read and reread? So often I find myself going back and revisiting old build guides that I've followed, old build guides that maybe I haven't gotten a chance to play yet but want to, maybe old build guides that explain a mechanic that I've previously been unfamiliar with or that take advantage of and use a different unique item that I maybe haven't had a build use before. So if it's easy to read and then easy to reread, that's very, very important for the accessibility of the build. Secondly, does the build guide include a pros and cons list showing off the benefits and risks of the build? So some examples of this include whether or not the build is an expensive build, whether or not it's a league starter, or whether potentially it is something that you're going to build later on in a league when you've got more currency built up. Is it new player friendly? Is it something that maybe a player who isn't necessarily familiar with a wide swath of mechanics in Path of Exile that can simply jump in and get to know the game and fall in love with the game through this build? Or maybe is it a convoluted build that takes advantage of all sorts of different mechanics and that takes advantage of all sorts of different stats and different uniques and different itemization paths? What is it about the build that provides the greatest benefits as well as the greatest risks? Is it a hardcore viable build? That is very key, because if you are playing hardcore and you go in and you play a build and you die instantly and you're wondering, is this something wrong with me? Is this something that it's just that I got unlucky with? Or is it something wrong with the build? Well, it could be that the build wasn't actually built, and then maybe it wasn't actually even explained that it's not necessarily a hardcore viable build. So these are some things that help explain the build and show off whether or not the build is explained well in its knowledge and in its goals. Thirdly, does the build guide show what its goals are? Now, in this case, we're talking about whether or not it's a league starter, a boss killer, a lab farmer, a magic finder, a support character. Is it specialized just for delving or some other league mechanic? What exactly was the goal in mind of the build guide's author when they went about building this particular guide? Depending on what their goal is and how they communicate that clearly to us as the potential shopper of a particular build, that really makes a difference. Because if you've got, I don't know, let's say a league start that's about to drop and you're looking for a league starter, you need to know if the build is going to be sufficient and able to take on various parts of the game, maybe with limited amounts of currency and limited amounts of uniques at your disposal. Also, maybe if it's more niche in its particular goals, that's actually really, really helpful. For a lot of different folks out there, you might be thinking, oh, well, if it's a really, really niche build, the best builds are just league starter builds that explain everything, are easy to get into, and you can hop in right away. Well, maybe it's a really, really niche build like a magic find build or a specific type of delver character or a specific kind of support that's meant to run alongside another sort of maybe DPS or other supports alongside it in group play. That's all really helpful to know going in, because it's going to help explain why some of the decisions that the build guide's author went into when they designed the build. Tip number 2, who made the build? This is something that you're going to want to check out. Be a little bit discriminatory. Use your judgment when you are following a build guide. If somebody is posting a build guide and they have one forum post and they've maybe never played the game before, and they just joined the game yesterday, or at least according to their account, that's when they did. Maybe you should be skeptical about that build, because it's probably not going to be a build that has been well tested and is extensively put on a show for the various levels and difficulties and challenges that are going to be thrown its way throughout the course of its existence in Path of Exile. So you're going to want to check who made the build. How long has the guide's author been playing? This is actually something that you can do as you are checking out the build guide. You can do this. This is a great example. You can simply click on anybody's name on a build guide. This is one of Ghazzy's builds right here, which Ghazzy is a wonderful YouTuber and streamer. So you can always go check him out. And all of these build guides, by the way, are linked down below in the video description that are just examples of what I'm displaying and talking about here in terms of hallmarks for build guides. This is Ghazzy's profile. So you can see here right away, he joined all the way back in 2014. His last visit was February 21st of 2019. He averages about 1.96 posts per day on the forum, so he checks it regularly, and he's got a guild, right? So you can at least know, oh, this is a build that was made by Ghazzy. He's been around for a long time. He probably knows what he's talking about and has some depth of knowledge as it relates to Path of Exile, as well as a historical sense of where Path of Exile once was and where it is potentially today. So that's very, very key. Secondly, what is their challenge count on the most recent challenge league? This is very, very important when it comes to playing in a temporary challenge league, because if you're playing maybe a build that is based off of another build or a build that has been influenced by somebody else, that's great. You always want to go back to whoever the original source was, because if the original source is somebody that maybe isn't playing in the most recent challenge league, or maybe they're not completing a lot of challenge league goals, even in the low to mid teens, not necessarily somebody that's gone 40 for 40 in terms of challenges, but even if it's in the low to mid teens, that at least lets you know that that is a person who is actively engaged with the present state of Path of Exile as a game. Whereas if you look at a build guide and you see, oh, this person maybe hasn't played for a couple of leagues, they haven't supported for a couple of leagues, and they maybe haven't posted for a couple of leagues, well, then when you go and check out their build guide, if it seems like it's out of date and maybe it's not taking into consideration different mechanics that have been introduced to Path of Exile, it's because it hasn't taken into account many different mechanics that have come into Path of Exile, because maybe it's an out-of-date build. So what's their challenge count on the most recent leagues? Also, thirdly, does the build guide include updates? So this segues really nicely. A lot of build guides do a great job of simply saying whether or not their build guide is an ongoing project or whether or not it has been discontinued. I love this build guide right here by Natt, because his Burning Spectre Summoner, he says right at the very beginning in the header, he's gone in and changed it. It's discontinued for now. He says, look, I started this in 3.0. That was its build birthday. It went through 3.1, 3.2, and then it got a third nerf. It was nerfed once in 3.1, nerfed again in 3.2, nerfed again in 3.3. And he says in 3.4, hey, look, I am not going to be updating this anymore, and I'm not presently going to be playing this build. So you can at least know right away as soon as you get into the build guide, oh, this isn't a build guide that's going to be updated, which doesn't mean that it's a bad build guide. It simply means you're going to have to do the legwork to try to think out and work out exactly what the changes in the current present league that you're playing in will be. So if it includes updates is a key. This gives crucial insight into whether or not a player is maintaining the build to provide relevant thoughts for the current league. So at least think about that as you are playing and looking at and evaluating build guides for your own builds. Third tip today, does the build show gameplay? So are there links to watch the build in action, whether that's on Twitch, whether that's on YouTube, whether that's through GIFs, whether that's on other streaming services? Are there links for you to be able to actually watch the build in action? And what does the build feel like and look like in action? This is the greatest way to tell without syncing and prior to syncing tons of hours and currency of your own time and your own resources into a build, to actually get a feel for what this build may be like to play. This is essentially what I think of as window shopping. You know, when you're walking by a store and you see something in the window and it looks good, and so you decide, hey, I might buy that. That looks good to me. I'm going to try that out. This is what gameplay footage does for us as Path of Exile community members. By having gameplay footage, it actually allows us to test out and to essentially give the eye test to something. Does this look like something that I would enjoy playing before we dump a bunch of hours and currency into the build? It also provides visible proof for the build's claims. So if a build says, I've killed all the content in the game, okay, show me. Show me if you've done that. If you can't show me that your build has done that, it doesn't mean you're a liar. It doesn't mean that I'm calling somebody out. It simply means that you haven't provided video evidence of it happening. That there's a lot of different factors that could go into that. It could be that your PC can't handle you recording. It could be that you don't have time to stream or to make a video. That's perfectly fine. But as we're evaluating build guides, if you can't window shop to see what a build looks like in action, then that's a big knock on the build guide to actually be able to test it out. It essentially goes back to that whole try it before you buy it sort of proverb. And if there's not visible proof of what the build claims, then you ought to be skeptical of it, at least to a certain extent. Thirdly, what sorts of content is displayed in the gameplay video? So is the gameplay video showing off what leveling looks like with the character? Is it showing off what bossing in the end game looks like for the character? Is it showing off maybe what side mechanics from a new league looks like on a new particular character? Is it a specific niche side area that maybe the character has actually been built to farm? I'm thinking of like low-level delving or even betrayal runs where you're constantly running back and forth in low-level instances. What sorts of content is displayed in the gameplay video? And is that content relevant to your goals as you want to continue to play that build? The fourth tip, what's the budget of the build? You'll want to check out what the itemization and simply what the relative cost of the build might be. Lots of different factors can come into play. Maybe if this is a league starter build for you, that's great. You can play that at any point in time. Maybe if this is a build that's a little bit more expensive, you're going to play it later on in the league, or you'll hold off onto it to play maybe in standard when you've accumulated some more wealth. So what is the cost of the build? You're going to want to check out, quite simply, the cost. And one of the things that I really like about this build from Natt is that he simply shows you, hey, here are some of the items that you're going to need to use. And he even says, hey, look, here's a Vis Mortis, which, by the way, for the history of most of Path of Exile has not been that expensive. And he even says down below, a 5-link cloak or Vis Mortis is better than a Tabula Rasa, which means you don't even have to 6-link it. If you can get your hand on this relatively cheap unique, you can 5-link it and you are good to go for his particular build for the goals that he set. So I really, really appreciate that he gives you some uniques. And as you're scrolling down, you can even see he's got some different options that are uniques as you start out a league or maybe as you start to scale up the build. So there are some low-end purchases that you can make to get the build rolling. And then as you acquire more currency, you can then dump more currency into the build and make it better. I really appreciate that he does this. And so you're going to want to look for similar sorts of progression or cost explanation of what the build may cost. A second question is, how many uniques are required for the build? So if a build requires a ton of uniques to get started and to really enable the build to get off the ground, then maybe it's not a good choice for a league starter. Whereas if you see a build that's got maybe just less uniques in general and more rares, okay, that's something that you can work out as a league starter, and maybe you can even scale it up later on in the game as you craft and purchase better and better rares. What has the trend of specific roles been in previous leagues? This is something to look at if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of the economics of a particular build. You can simply follow the trends. Now, this is, of course, with the added exception and disclaimer that every single update that comes out from Path of Exile has the risk and the chance of different uniques, different items, different drop rates, and different builds being affected in their price and in their economic value in trade leagues. So what you're going to want to do is look at the trend of specific roles, whether that's specific stats on rares or whether that's just specific items in general, specific divination cards in general. And you're going to want to see what the trend is. If there haven't been any changes, whether that's to the drop rate, whether that's to the rarity of the item, or whether that's to the numeric values and the statistical properties of the item, then in general, it's going to stay rather stable. If, of course, there's been massive, massive changes, maybe to a favorite ascendancy of a particular build, or changes to a specific skill gem, or, of course, changes to the rarity, or nerfs or buffs to particular roles on the build, then that's going to change its economic value. So you're going to want to check that out in particular. General rule is that the fewer uniques that are needed on a build, the more starter friendly it is at the beginning of a league. I realize that is a general rule, so please take that as such. It is a general rule. That is not an absolute rule that holds across every single instance and every single build. But that is a general rule, so you can look at builds, and if it's got maybe 1 or 2 uniques here or there, it's probably going to be rather simple to get started. Fourthly, what items are the build enablers that make the build special, unique, and clearly defined? You're going to want to check the level requirements on these, because oftentimes builds will have an end game status that is maybe different than their leveling status. And a lot of new players fall into the trap of thinking, oh, I can just play this build, and I've watched a gameplay video and it looked really, really cool, and so I want to go and play that build too. But the problem is that the build enabling uniques that make the build look the way it looks in the gameplay video are required level 68, which means for 67 levels, you got to play with other stuff. Now, is that a big deal? Is that a make or break for you as you're choosing to play this build, or maybe not playing this build? It's good to know ahead of time as you're reading and evaluating whether or not you're going to follow that particular build guide. Fifth tip of the day, does the build show how to level? So speaking of how certain characters look different in the end game than they do throughout the story and throughout the leveling process, is there a walkthrough or a write-up of how to take the character and how it can be piloted from level 1 to the end game and to whatever goal it is that you've got for that particular character? Some particular players have done a great job of this, and I wanted to show this off right here. This is AkumaNoTsubasa. I can never say his name, but I love the way that he writes this particular build guide up. You can of course check it down below in the video description. He writes up here the leveling in the passive tree. He says level 1 through 12, just take whatever you want. I like lightning tendrils or freezing pulse. Just put them into a +1 wand and support with onslaught and added lightning damage. Then he says level 12 through the end game. He says you do not need to wait for anything. Just take Stormbrand instantly and smash in whatever supports you can get until you have access to the needed supports. So for this particular build, he says you can play this and you can level with this. And then of course, as you're going through, there are some things that you can do to improve the build. So if you want to make the leveling process better, use a tabula and a gold rim. If you want to have particular priorities in terms of your passive tree and in terms of your ascendancy nodes, boom, here you go. Here are some key nodes for you to maybe be looking out for. These are wonderful ways that help you and I evaluate whether or not a build guide is worth playing, because there's a walkthrough. It can simply tell us at level 1, this is how I'm going to play, or maybe this is a suggested way to play, and then taking us all the way through to the end game version of the build. Does the build guide explain the choices and benefits of various ascendancy options? So this is something that's a little bit of a sticking point. There are several different skills, both spells and attacks, throughout Path of Exile that can be played multiple ways. It's one of the things that draws, or has drawn, so much popularity for Path of Exile, is its diversity and its ability to allow players to choose different options for their class and their subclass and the particular types of character that they would like to build. So one of the things that's really a hallmark of an exceptional build is being able to show off these are your options, not just in terms of your leveling and not just in terms of different choices and itemizations, but here's even different characters that you can play this particular build with. And that's really, really fun to do. I've actually leveled several different characters using the same sorts of active gems, the same sorts of spells and attacks, and simply switched ascendancies to see which is better. It's really, really fun to do, to see which ascendancy performs better in a particular role and with a particular setup. So if a build guide offers that, it's always helpful to know, because then you know what options you've got. You don't feel like, oh, I was pigeonholed into playing this one particular thing, and then maybe you have buyer's remorse when you see, oh, other people are playing the same thing and maybe have a little bit different take on it. This also is relevant for, of course, updates and patches and buffs and nerfs, because maybe if one ascendancy gets nerfed, the build itself isn't dead because another ascendancy was playable with the particular build anyway, and it's better now. Thirdly, does the build guide explain which bandit option should choose and why? This is important and not just important to have included. A lot of build guides will simply say, kill the bandits, or take a Lyra, or take Oak, right? That's fine. That's fine if it says that. But one of the things that sets apart a great build guide is when a build guide explains why they chose to take a particular bandit or why they chose to take a particular passive. In general, the reason why a particular bandit is chosen or why the 2 passive points are chosen are because there's more things that you need to do on the passive tree, so you'll need more passive points, or the passive points that you were going to put on the passive tree are not as valued as the stats that you get back from the bandit. This, and case in point, oftentimes occurs with Lyra builds where you need maybe all elemental resistances as well as some crit multi, because those builds oftentimes use a lot of uniques, so they can't get a lot of their elemental resistances from rares in various itemization slots. And if you're a crit build, all of the crit in the world is, of course, needed, required, and fun, so why wouldn't you grab the extra crit? Fourthly, is there a path of building pace bin included? Path of building is by far and away the single best offline or just any tool that there is for theory crafting and sandboxing and building your guide and walking you through it in Path of Exile outside of actually playing the game itself. So if there's a path of building pace bin included, that's always very helpful. The other thing that you can do if there's not a path of building pace bin included is you can, of course, search a character's profile. The risk in searching the build guide author's profile is that maybe the character that they originally had built with that particular build guide in mind has maybe been changed in Standard League at some point to test out another build. So there's always that risk. So the shortcut to avoid all of that hassle is simply, is there a path of building pace bin included? And if there is, that's great because it makes it easier for all of us. The 6th and almost final tip, we'll have a bonus tip in here in just a moment, but is there a template for your goals? This is coming back and evaluating yourself. What goals do you have as you are playing this character? And does this build enable you to reach those goals? So basically, we're asking, is the build fun? Does the build look fun to you? Is this going to enable you to have fun? If anybody is ever telling you how to play Path of Exile or how to use any of your hobby or free time, really just tell them, hey, it's my free time and I'm going to choose to use it how I want, doing things that I enjoy. So don't let anybody else tell you what's fun. Don't let anybody else demand that you play a certain thing. You ask yourself, is this build fun? And am I going to enjoy this build? Is this build going to enable me to have a good time? Will this character help me accomplish my goals for this character? Oftentimes, characters in Path of Exile are built with particular niches in mind. So, for example, I'll just use myself really quickly. Occasionally, I will play support characters. Usually, I'll dedicate 1 or 2 character slots to a support character per league. And I like to do that because I like to play with other players inside Path of Exile. So, if my goal is to play with other players in Path of Exile, does playing a support character allow me to do that? Yes, it does. Great. So then a build guide for a support character helps me accomplish that goal. Sometimes I also like to play as the Magic Find character in a group setting. So I want to play with other players, but now I want to be the one that's doing the DPS and choosing which maps we run. Well, will this build help me accomplish my goals for this character? Of course it will, because I'm running the DPS and I'm going to be running the maps and choosing what sort of maps that we run over and, of course, how we split the loot. That's great. So that's going to be a fun build for me and I'm going to choose it. Whether that's mapping, bossing, Uberlab, farming and particular item or cards, whether that's delving or interacting with a particular side area, answering these sorts of questions for yourself is key to actually evaluating the build guide, because the build guide might be good for somebody else. It might be an exceptional build guide for somebody else, but if it doesn't match up with what's fun in your own personal goals for a build and for a character, then it's simply not a good build guide for you at this time. All right, so bonus tips. We've got a couple down below. Does the build guide's author respond to questions? If not, are there other players who are actively using the thread for discussion on the build? We've shown off a couple of different builds that are discontinued here today, and yet it's very, very key, as I said earlier in the video, if it's discontinued, that means other players are going to have to go around and actually do the legwork to figure out how that build will translate to a new particular league or the present particular league. Well, maybe there are other people asking similar questions to you. I know I've done this on several different build guides where I've gone in and asked questions of the build author. A lot of the times, build authors will have a Twitch stream link available, a YouTube clip link available, or we'll even have their email or their Twitter. And so you can get a hold of people, not just on the forum thread themselves, but you can oftentimes get a hold of a particular author. That is, of course, if the author themselves has given you permission to do so. So use the methods and the mechanisms that you do to ask the questions that you've got for the build. Maybe the questions that you've got have already been answered and already been interacted with down in the thread somewhere. So it's oftentimes very, very helpful to go throughout the thread, not just reading the first page where the build guide author has actually addressed their build guide and their vision for the build, but oftentimes actually checking out what sort of other questions and what sort of other interactions are going on. It can also sometimes function as a little bit of like an IT group help or group support help, where I cannot tell you the number of times I've been looking up a particular mechanic or testing something and I've found an answer to it in a build guide or in a response to a question in a build guide thread. So that is absolutely huge. So always, always, always when you're choosing a build guide for you, look through the thread, because chances are questions that other people are having about the build may be questions you yourself will have for the build later on down the road. Check those discussions as oftentimes edits, suggestions, or corrections are simply made in elongated discussions throughout the thread, and they don't make it back up to the original post. So some build guide authors are very, very good about grabbing all of the conversations that are going on in their particular thread and then reposting them at the top of the thread inside, an FAQ section. Some build guide authors aren't great at that. So check the discussions, because those discussions are really, really important and are going to give you a lot of help when it comes to maybe beating your head against the wall going, why isn't this build working the way the video shows? Well, chances are somebody else has had that experience as well. Thirdly, does the build display different ascendancy choices? So we chatted about this a little bit earlier, but this is really, really key. Nowadays in Path of Exile, you have just a plethora of options in terms of your skills, both active as well as support, as well as the passive tree, as well as your ascendancy choice. If the build is at all viable to be played for other ascendancy choices, ask the build author if they've tried it out on different things. Chances are, this is from my own personal experience in interacting with build authors, chances are they've probably at least thought about it, if not having tried it themselves and then made a decision on which way to particularly go. We also have, of course, in Path of Exile, the Ascendant, which is, the Scion that has got the ability to simply pick and choose from various different ascendancies. So it never hurts to ask questions about, hey, what would this particular build look like if I swapped to a Scion and maybe started poking around with different options and different ascendancies? It's a great way to exercise your own skills and your own knowledge in the game of Path of Exile to simply try to stretch what the build is and how it would change if it was put into another ascendancy or if it was put to use by another ascendancy. So thanks so much for watching. We've got some discussions of topics for us to interact with down below. I always love reading and checking out your comments and participating in the discussion that we have as a community. It's one of the things that I love about being a part of this community here in G3 is the awesome discussions that we have, the questions that we have, how we help out new players coming along, and how veteran players can have awesome discussions. So you can leave a comment down below with your own thoughts, tips, and ideas. I probably didn't cover everything. In fact, I know I didn't cover everything because I couldn't fit everything that I wanted to inside this short video. So how do you decide what build guide is right for you? And what are some general ideas or concepts that maybe you would like to pass along to the rest of the community when you're looking for a build guide? What sort of tips, or maybe what one or two things you'd like to pass on that you've noticed has been helpful when evaluating build guides, has helped you, and you'd like to pass that on to the rest of the community? Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate your comments, and thanks so much to all of our supporters. I hope that today is the day you start a new build using an awesome build guide and find a Mirror of Galandra.